Marvel's up to some pretty exciting stuff right now, and it fascinates me because in a lot of ways it mirrors the direction that DC is going. And yet there are a few surprises or a few breadcrumbs that I'm following that I'm not sure everyone else is. So let's talk about it, shall we? In the last few weeks, we've gotten some very, very interesting news regarding Spider-Man and regarding the concept of the multiverse. Remember, last year, they teased us with the thought of a multiverse entering the fray in Spider-Man Far From Home. Remember, it ended up just being a fake out by Jake Gyllenhaal's Mysterio, and there was no true multiverse in that Spider-Man sequel. But it looks like Marvel is actually going to deliver on the promise of that in its next phase of films. And now let's kind of go step by step on the stuff that has me going, Because first of all, at the end of Far From Home, there was the very cool but very sort of odd choice. At the time, it seemed odd, I should say, that the J.K. Simmons, J. Jonah Jameson, the version that we got to know and love during the original 3 Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, he showed up at the end of Far From Home, and it's like, what? How does Tom Holland get the same Jameson that Tobey Maguire got? You know, it was a peculiar thing, to say the least. But then, like 3 weeks ago, I want to say, they announced that Jamie Foxx's Electro, that's right, Jamie Foxx's Electro, the one from The Amazing Spider-Man 2, directed by Mark Webb and starring Andrew Garfield, that Electro is going to be in the 3rd Tom Holland Spider-Man movie. Now, Fox has already assured us that he's not going to be blue, and it's going to be a slight, it's not going to be the same exact Electro that we've gotten to know and love already. Well, some of us knew and loved him. Most of us went, really? Is it Batman and Robin all over again? Is this Batman Forever, or is this a Spider-Man movie in 2017? Or was it 2016 at that time? I'm not even positive anymore, but let's see. Now this is going to bother me. I think it was 2015, wasn't it? I don't know. I'll fact check myself later. Right now, that's not what's important. What's important is that Jamie Foxx's Electro is going to be in Spider-Man 3. So that had me going, fascinating. So you have Jameson from the Maguire franchise. You have Electro from the Garfield franchise. And then last week, what did they announce? They announced that Benedict Cumberbatch's Doctor Strange was going to be showing up in this 3rd Spider-Man movie. Now that makes things really interesting, because what's the name of the next Doctor Strange movie? And we know how Marvel likes to have their films kind of build to and lead into one another. So what is the next Doctor Strange movie? It's Doctor Strange Into the Multiverse of Madness. So you have a Doctor Strange that's about to be exploring the multiverse in a big way in his movie, showing up in Spider-Man 3. And who's directing Doctor Strange Into the Multiverse of Madness? Sam freaking Raimi. I feel like people forget about that. Because, I mean, honestly, it almost feels like it can't be true. Because Marvel doesn't really do that typically. You know, they're not known for hiring like very well-known, very established filmmakers, let alone filmmakers who worked on previous iterations of these characters. So Sam Raimi is returning to the world of Marvel. And that is a huge deal in and of itself that I don't think gets enough fanfare. Like when I talk to other movie geeks about this, a lot of them forget that Raimi is the one giving us the 2nd Doctor Strange movie. And that's huge because, listen, prior to 2002, DC owned the comic book movie genre. You know, from 78 to 87, we got 4 Superman movies, pretty much nothing on the Marvel front that wasn't some sort of direct-to-video nonsense. Then from 89 to 97, we got 4 Batman movies. Again, there were some Marvel films, but again, it was like straight-to-video Captain America type stuff. So for the first 22 years, It was all DC. 22 years following Christopher Reeve Superman movies. It was all DC all the time. And then, yes, Marvel released Blade. There was the Blade movies. There was the first X-Men, and those were all pretty good hits. But Blade was more underground, and X-Men didn't really explode until it was time for X2. When X2 came out, I think that's really when the X-Men IP became a much bigger deal. But before that, because X2, I believe, came out in 03 or 04. In 02, when Raimi gave us the first Spider-Man movie with Tobey Maguire, he handed Marvel their first huge crossover, mainstream, tentpole comic book movie victory. And each of these subsequent sequels for those Raimi movies were all these huge event films. They were, entire movie slates were kind of built around their proximity to Spider-Man 2 and Spider-Man 3. And I remember going to those theaters. I remember the energy in those movie theaters watching the Spider-Man movies. It was a huge event. So for the first time, Marvel got its taste at true cinematic box office glory through Sam Raimi. And also Raimi, in a lot of ways, set sort of what should we call it? We should call it, the formula, to an extent, that the Marvel Cinematic Universe still uses to this day. Because you have the action, you have the comedy, you have the Easter eggs, and you have something that doesn't take itself insanely seriously, but that does honor the source material. So Marvel has been building upon what Raimi gave us 18 years ago, and now Raimi himself is going to be directing another Marvel movie, and the star of his Marvel movie is going to be showing up in a Spider-Man movie. So right now, it strikes me as a very, very strong possibility that Fandom Wire's recent rumor is true. And in case that confuses you, I'll recap. Fandom Wire recently reported that both Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield were going to be showing up in Spider-Man 3 with Tom Holland. And they also apparently have some story details where one of the reasons why Jamie Foxx's Electro is returning is because in the third act, Spider-Man is going to encounter villains from across his entire cinematic history. So if we're going to have Tobey Maguire back, if we're going to have Andrew Garfield back, if we're going to have other villains from the original trilogy show up played by their original actors, I mean, things are about to get really freaking insane over on the Marvel front. And it's funny, right? Because most of this year, we've been talking about how DC is leaning very heavily into the multiverse concept. And we've been freaking out over the fact that Michael Keaton is returning to Batman. And that Ben Affleck is going to get a chance to play Batman again in the Flashpoint movie. And that the Flashpoint movie itself, which might just be called The Flash, but it is basically in a loose way adapting the Flashpoint story and pushing DC full steam ahead into the multiverse. So there's been a lot of chatter about that. But now in these last couple of weeks, it's starting to become clear that Marvel is moving in a very similar direction. And the part that pisses me off is that they're going to get there before DC does. It kills me. It never fails to kill me that Warner Brothers and DC will always create or give off the impression that they're playing catch up, that they are trying to mimic or build upon what Marvel is doing, when we know they're not. But it's just bad timing or poor planning or whatever you want to call it. But right? First of all, they beat us to a shared universe, which now DC isn't even really sure they really want to do, which is one of the reasons why the multiverse came up for them. But they beat us to a big, successful shared universe. Then they also beat us to the big team-up movie, right? Because we got 2 Avengers movies before we ever got a Justice League. And we know that there's going to be more Avengers stuff on the way, while the Justice League, as we know it, is kind of back on the shelf. And who knows when DC is going to get back to another one of those team-ups. So they built us to the shared universe. They built us to the big seismic team up. They got to Thanos before we got to Darkseid. They're going to get their Eternals movie out before we get our the New Gods movie out. And now, and this is the one that I'm like, I can't believe this. If they get Tobey Maguire, then in a way, they're going to beat us to Keaton returning as Batman. Because right now, if the release dates hold up and these production timelines all hold up, we're looking at a Spider-Man movie that comes out in December of 2021, followed by a Doctor Strange sequel that comes out 3 months later. And in both of those movies, we're going to be leaning very heavily on the multiverse concept, and we're going to be bringing back previous iterations of these characters played by their iconic original actors. So Marvel's going to be doing that over the course of 3 months between December and March at the end of 2021. And then we're going to get that Flash movie 3 months after that in June of 2022. So that means that when Michael Keaton returns as Batman, it's actually going to have a little bit of that been there, done that, if Spider-Man is able to bring Tobey Maguire back to the role. And that just chaps my ass in a big way. It really does. Because here we go. DC has all of these really exciting plans and all of these things that I think are going to help basically bring the franchise to a whole new, level. But Marvel's going to get there before us in the months leading up to the release of Flash. So I just hope that there isn't a big, been there, done that sort of feeling when we get to Flashpoint, because it really is something that Marvel is working on things that are very similar to what DC is working on. And by the way, I'm not trying to imply some sort of conspiracy, like James Gunn is leaking secrets to Kevin Feige or all that kind of stuff that people love to get very into the weeds about. I just think it's a crappy coincidence. I think it's a crappy coincidence that both franchises are heading in a particular direction, but Marvel's going to get there first. But it is what it is. All I know is, if the Spider-Man threequel and Doctor Strange can live up to their very unique potential promise, this is going to be 2022 is going to be a fascinating year. Because remember too, Sam Raimi is not your typical Marvel director. Kevin Feige loves to bring in young up-and-comers, people who he can kind of get to play ball with what he wants to do, right? Because he, as the producer, is really kind of in charge when it comes to Marvel Studios. It's not like a filmmaker-driven studio where they give the director their script and their budget and their locations and everything they need and then just trust them to go make their movie, kind of like what Warner Brothers is doing with Matt Reeves right now, which is super exciting. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But not only Warner Brothers does that, Marvel doesn't. And yet, you don't hire a guy like Sam Raimi because you want a good soldier or because you want a yes man who's just going to do whatever you want and is not going to try to put their own creative flourishes into this thing. You hire Sam Raimi to make a Sam Raimi movie. And here you have a guy with a horror background and a Marvel background doing a supernatural Doctor Strange movie. So to me, the possibilities of what could be happening across Spider-Man 3 and Doctor Strange 2, there's a lot of potential there and a lot of really exciting storytelling avenues. And if they're trying to get Tobey Maguire back, having Sam Raimi in the mix, I'm sure is going to kind of help him make that decision to come back and put on the red and blue tights again, if he does decide to do that, But I really just wanted to touch on that. I wanted to touch on the fact that Marvel is heading into the multiverse. They're bringing back previous actors in much the same way that DC is going to do it. And I don't know how to feel about that. To me, it's on the one hand, it's exciting. On the other hand, I kind of wish DC would be the only one doing that, so that when Michael Keaton shows up as Batman again, the world loses its mind. As opposed to what it might be, where it just comes off like, oh, look, DC's trying to do what Marvel did. Marvel got back Maguire, they got back Keaton. All right, let's see what happens next. I hope that Marvel doesn't basically steal the thunder of where DC is headed, because I'm still very excited about where DC is headed. But it's just very interesting to me that both franchises are heading in like the same direction over the course of the same like 6-month window of movie releases. So we'll see how that plays out. Either way, I'm very intrigued to have Electro back. I'm very intrigued to see how or if they acknowledge, that this is the same J. Jonah Jameson that Tobey Maguire dealt with. Do they get Maguire back? In what capacity will Keaton be used in the Flashpoint movie? All of this stuff with the multiverse, it's such a fascinating place to be as a fan. And as a commentator, as someone who tries to keep up on the trends and on what audiences are buying and what they're not buying and all that sort of stuff, it's going to be really interesting to see how both franchises unfold these, storytelling mechanisms, and who pulls it off better. Are they able to, get the mainstream audience to buy into this multiverse concept? Or is Marvel going to do it and it's just going to confuse the hell out of everyone? And then when DC does it, it's going to be more of the same. I don't know. It's going to be very interesting to sort of figure out where things are headed. And Sony, I'm sure, is very intrigued by all this too. Because remember, they've been trying to get this whole, Spider-Verse thing going for years with the Into the Spider-Verse animated film. Now they're going to basically bring that same idea to the live action, which gives them a lot of creative leeway. Because it means that even if they were to decide, you know what, we're going to leave the Tom Holland Spider-Man as part of the MCU, now that you've introduced that there's a million Peter Parkers out there, you have options. You could cast an all-new Peter Parker. You could bring back Andrew Garfield, who loved being the character. And there was a lot of fans who just felt like, he was a great Spider-Man who was in some mediocre Spider-Man movies. If they could put Andrew Garfield into some good Spider-Man movies and maybe have him be the one who faces Tom Hardy's Venom and Woody Harrelson's Carnage, I wonder how that would go over. Regardless, kind of blowing open the doors here and saying that all of these other versions of the characters exist really gives Sony the ultimate way to basically move into their own Spider-Man realm after this third Spider-Man movie. Whether they want to use Holland or not, by establishing this whole thing about the infinite Earths and how many Spider-Man there are and how many Electros and how many, there are, they could very easily have a whole other Spider-Man ready to go moving forward after that. Or they could bring in Holland. The point is, the possibilities are now endless. So I'm sure Sony is very excited that Marvel has decided to actually, follow through on the multiverse concept.